Hello, everybody. This is Franklin Iron Age News, South Florida Conservative News Service, Monday, June 1st, 5 p.m. I don't know what's going on with the computer, but something's going on. And today we will talk about Colombia, the Colombian election, and where the country's presidential election has become about far more than who will occupy the presidential palace next. Instead, Colombians are wrestling with a larger, more consequential question, which is, can the election itself be trusted? And at that point, the center of that debate stands with one man, El Presidente Gustavo Petro. This is the story of what we will call the Petro factor. Petrification, I guess. Not whether Petro will win, because he cannot run again, not whether his preferred successor will win, but whether Colombia's democratic institutions can command public confidence when the outgoing president carries a revolutionary past, questions what he would consider unfavorable electoral results, and governs during a period of renewed political violence. So let's begin with the election. On paper, Colombia's 2026 election looks democratic. There are ballots being cast, there are voters being counted. Candidates are campaigning. The constitutional process remains intact, and yet there is another side to the story. The campaign has unfolded amidst political violence, growing insecurity, and depolarization. Most notably, presidential contender Miguel Uribe Turbay was assassinated very publicly during the campaign, a shocking moment that reminded Colombians of a darker period in their nation's history. And at the same time, armed groups remained active in many portions of the country, and concerns over security have become a dominant issue among voters. As one can imagine, maybe we don't trust the votes that are in areas that are controlled by the guerrillas, right? In that environment, trust becomes just as important as the procedure, because, as you all know, even if you're in the United States, democracy is not simply about counting votes. It's about convincing people that the votes count. To understand why this election has become so controversial, you need to understand a little bit about Gustavo Petro. Petro is unlike many presidents in the Western Hemisphere. Before entering politics, he was a member of the M19 guerrilla movement. For those of you who are younger out there, and for international audiences, that name may not immediately resonate, but the Colombians will remember it. M19 remains most closely associated with one of the most dramatic and tragic events in the nation's history, a veritable low water mark for law and order in the country of Colombia, and that was the 1985 Palace of Justice siege. In that operation, M19 guerrillas seized Colombia's Supreme Court building and took hostages. The Colombian military responded with overwhelming force, and when the fighting ended, roughly 100 people were dead, including 11 Supreme Court justices. The Palace of Justice became a national trauma and remains one of the defining events of modern Colombia. In fact, they changed the front of the building, if you ever go down there, from the way it looked prior to the siege to what it looks like today. Totally different. Now, it is important to note that Petro himself did not participate in the operation because he was imprisoned during much of that period. But politics is not merely about personal responsibility. It is about historical association, and Petro's association with M19 remains an unavoidable part of his political biography. So in 1990, Colombia made a historic choice. M19 agreed to demobilize, its members laid down their weapons, and the Colombian state allowed them to enter politics. You're going to see that in the United States, by the way, if in certain states, especially California. The idea was simple. If revolutionaries could pursue their goals through elections instead of violence, then everybody's happy. It's a win-win, right? So for years, Petro appeared to validate that theory. He became a congressman, he was the mayor of Bogota, and eventually he was the president. So to supporters, Petro represented the success of reconciliation. Here he is, he's a former insurgent, he's become a democratic leader, kind of, but critics saw something very different. They argued that Colombia had not transformed a revolutionary movement into Democrats. Instead, they believe revolutionary actors had simply found a different route to political power. United States again. For decades, that debate remained largely theoretical. And as of today, I think it's become pretty real. The first round of Colombia's election intensified those concerns. Petro's preferred political successor failed to secure first place. It's a different system. They do percentages and then highest percentage goes forward. Instead, the conservative candidate Abelardo de la Espriella, am I saying that right? Espriella emerged ahead of everybody in the voting. And that happened next has attracted considerable attention. Okay. Petro publicly questioned aspects of the electoral process and raised concerns about irregularities in vote tabulation because his boy hadn't won. Now, whether those concerns proved valid is almost secondary. The larger issue is the effect they have on public confidence. Democracies require something very simple from political leaders: the willingness to accept outcomes they do not like. Once leaders begin challenging unfavorable results, trust begins to erode, and truth is difficult to rebuild. This is not a left-wing program. This is not a right-wing problem. It is a Democrat problem, democracy problem. Okay? So what makes the Colombia situation unique is that several issues are converging at the same time. First, the president comes from a movement that once challenged the Colombian state through violence. Second, armed groups continue to operate and in some regions have expanded their influence. Third, the election itself has been marked by violence, including the assassination of a major presidential contender. And fourth, the outgoing president has showed a willingness to question electoral administration when his coalition faces possible defeat, with no evidence of any kind. None of these developments individually prove anti-democratic intent. Together, however, they create suspicion, and that suspicion is the Petro factor. It is not necessarily about what Petro has done, it is about what millions of Colombians fear could happen. Petro supporters argue that the concerns are exaggerated. After all, he reached office through elections, areas that his terrorist buddies controlled with guns, they later controlled with the ballot box. You know what I'm saying? He is constitutionally barred from seeking another term. The election is moving forward. The courts remain functioning. Congress remains functioning. The military is definitely, in my mind, not on his side. In this view, Petro represents the triumph of democratic integration. But critics point to a different reality. They argue that amnesty did not erase history. They note that M19's past remains relevant. I guess if you want to go proportionately through the amount of elected officials that they and other terrorist groups have had still in the government, yeah. They point to deteriorating security conditions. They question the effectiveness of the government's peace initiatives. And they worry that the political instincts of revolutionary movements do not disappear simply because those movements exchanged uniforms for suits. Whether those fears are justified remains an open question, but they are undoubtedly influencing public perceptions of the election. The real test for Colombia has not yet occurred. The voting itself is only part of the process. The more important question is what happens afterwards. If Petro's coalition loses and accepts defeat, Colombia's democratic institutions will emerge stronger. Because honestly, you're the group that's in charge. You have the guns, you have the this, you have the that, and you lose and say somebody fixed the election. Very hard to do in the real world. The country, meaning Colombia, will have demonstrated that former revolutionaries can fully operate without constitutional boundaries, even when electoral outcomes are unfavorable. But if allegations of fraud continue to escalate, if trust continues to erode, or if political violence intensifies, then the debate will no longer be about vote totals. It will be about the health of Colombian democracy itself. In many cases, Colombia's election represents the final chapter of a story that began decades ago. It began with the guerrillas attempting to reshape the nation through force. It continued through a peace process that transformed insurgents into political actors, and it has now reached a moment when one of those former insurgents occupies the presidency. From the Palace of Justice to the presidential palace, Colombia has traveled a remarkable political journey. However, the question is now whether that journey is truly ended, because the future of Colombian democracy may depend less on who wins the election than on whether all sides are willing to accept the result. And that's basically where we are at this point. We will continue with this as the election moves forward. So if there are any questions, comments, feel free to contact us at any of our stations. Like and subscribe, I guess, if you're on YouTube or Rumble, because both of them throttle the traffic pretty good. And we've seen that, but what are you going to do? What's a girl to do? So otherwise, have a good night, and we'll talk to you later on.